What you are about to hear is history when it was news. These dispatches are read exactly as written on the date that the events occurred. Because of that, some terms may sound ancient, even offensive to the modern listener. Also, in many cases, the news is inaccurate to what historians know now. Sit back for a few minutes and let's travel back in time. Here are the latest news dispatches for April 13th, 1945, brought to you by our Patreon page. If you would like to follow World War II in chronological order in real time through the newspaper and radio, follow us on Patreon. The link is in the comments to this video. And now the news. Warm Springs, Georgia. President Franklin D. Roosevelt died unexpectedly yesterday at 4:35 p.m. of a cerebral hemorrhage. Mr. Roosevelt's last words were, "I have a terrific headache." He spoke them to Commander Harold Bruin, naval physician. Presidential Secretary William D. Hassett said Mr. Roosevelt's body would leave here around 9 a.m. today for the 22-hour run to Washington. Mrs. Roosevelt arrived here late last night. Mr. Roosevelt, age 63, was sitting in front of a fireplace in the Little White House here atop Pine Mountain when the attack struck him. Bruin described it as a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Washington, D.C. Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt was attending an afternoon benefit for a Washington charity being held at the Soulgrave Club yesterday when she received the news of her husband's death by telephone from Presidential Secretary Stephen Early. She went to the telephone, spoke a few words, put down the receiver, and walked out to her car without saying a word to anyone. Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, whose husband died as a result of his labors in World War I, was at the same party. When Mrs. Roosevelt arrived at the White House, Early took her to her sitting room on the second floor and said, "The president has slept away." Guam. Word of President Roosevelt's death reached his son, Lieutenant Commander Franklin Roosevelt Jr., off Okinawa this morning after a suicide Japanese air attack on American invasion forces. Young Roosevelt commands a destroyer escort on a screening assignment with the Okinawa force and was on the bridge directing his ship's anti-aircraft fire in a battle in which 118 Japanese planes were destroyed. Another Roosevelt son, Lieutenant John Roosevelt, is supply officer on an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. Washington, D.C. Harry S. Truman, one-time Missouri farm boy, was sworn in as the 32nd individual to become President of the United States in a simple ceremony in the Cabinet Room of the Executive Offices of the White House. He completed the oath, which was administered by Chief Justice Stone, at 7:09 p.m., 2 hours and 34 minutes after the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Standing behind him was his wife, Mrs. Beth Wallace Truman, his schoolgirl sweetheart, who occasionally dabbed at her tear-stained eyes. Washington, D.C. The White House announced early today that funeral services for Franklin D. Roosevelt will be held at 4 p.m. today in the East Room of the White House. Those who will attend will be high officials of the government, members of the Supreme Court, chiefs of foreign diplomatic missions, representatives of the Senate and House, and friends of the family. The time of burial at Hyde Park, New York has not been settled finally. The body of the late president will not lie in state, and the White House requested that the public not send flowers. Paris. United States 9th Army tanks smashed across the Elbe River on a 6-mile front 57 miles from Berlin yesterday. American 1st and 3rd Armies, in sweeps of nearly 50 miles, thundered towards the gates of the great city of Leipzig, 75 miles southwest of the capital. The 9th Army was less than 115 miles from the Russian Army lines. A field dispatch said only orders from Lieutenant General Simpson were needed to send the 2nd Armored Hell on Wheels Division dashing on into Berlin, which could possibly be reached today. Unconfirmed French reports said Allied parachute troops had been dropped at Brandenburg, about 20 miles from Greater Berlin. London. Russian armored forces leaving doomed Nazi forces in Vienna only a 7-mile escape gap yesterday cut the Austrian capital's last lifelines with Brünn, Czechoslovakia, while spearheads burst within 33 miles of that city in an invasion of southern Moravia. In the rubble-strewn streets of Vienna, Tommy gunners of Marshal Tobrukin's 3rd Ukrainian Army battled in house-to-house fighting and cleared Nazi holdout troops from 60 blocks of the Jewish quarter of Leopoldstadt between the Danube River and the Danube Canal. While Russian river gunboats landed Marines in the rear of German remnants in Vienna, Berlin reported a general Nazi withdrawal along the Danube Valley west of the capital toward Hitler's Bavarian mountain fortress at Berchtesgaden. Guam. Fighter-escorted B-29 superfortresses struck deeper into Japan Thursday in their longest mission yet from Marianas bases as they bombed Koriyama and Tokyo targets on Honshu Island by daylight. Flyers returning from the record 3,800-mile round trip to Koriyama Industrial Center 110 miles north of Tokyo reported they left large fires burning. This was the first raid so far north. The Tokyo target was the Nakajima aircraft engine plant, bombed 7 times before by B-29s. It was the 3rd raid this month on the plant. P-51 Mustang fighters, making their 2nd escort mission over Japan from Iwo, accompanied the bombers. Toronto. Frank McCool scored his 3rd consecutive shutout as the Toronto Maple Leafs took a stranglehold on the Stanley Cup by defeating the Detroit Red Wings 1-0 before a crowd of 13,560 tonight. Toronto leads the 8-point series 6-0. An impressive stillness hung over the crowd in a pre-game 1-minute silence in tribute to the late President Roosevelt. The only goal of the contest came in the 3rd period when Gus Bodnar, who hadn't scored against the Red Wings in 2 National Hockey League seasons, took a pass from defenseman Wally Stanowski and fired an angle shot home. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell. If you would like to follow World War II through the news and pop culture in chronological order, don't forget to follow us on Patreon. A link is in the comments to this video. You just heard the latest news dispatches for April 13th, 1945. My name is Henry Chop. Have a swell day.